Hey guys, and welcome back to the Pulse Podcast. I'm your host Daniel, and I'm joined with Mike. How you doing, Mike?
I'm good, man.
You're good. We've just been looking at some of these questions, and we've just been in awe with some of these wonderful questions you guys are asking us. We're really excited to get into the next episode. But if you're new here, welcome to the Pulse Podcast. I'm Daniel, and this is Mike. What we do here is that we just bring some Christian questions, and we try to answer them, keep the answers small, keep them simple, keep them bite-sized, and most importantly, keep them Christian. So we're going to jump straight into this question that we have today, and it's quite a jam-packed question. So I'm going to break it down small by small.
Shoot.
But the foundation of it basically is like the churches that we go to matter.
Yeah.
Right. So it's like, how do we even go about choosing a church and choosing a denomination? And when I saw this question, it really hit home with me, because I have friends around me who are trying to choose a church now. We've come from this, from people around my age who just come back from uni. Now you're back back in London. You found God when you were in uni. You want to go to a new church. It's all very confusing and overwhelming. Yeah. And sometimes you might be just like, a church is a church. It doesn't really matter where I go to. What's all this denomination talk about? So let's just start there. It's like, do the churches we go to even matter?
Yeah, that's a good question. The answer is yes.
Okay.
Unfortunately, the difficulty with our age is that there are lots of things that say church but aren't church. And we know that one thing that the enemy has at his disposal is deception.
Yeah.
And so I wish I could just say, doesn't matter, just go to any church. But I actually can't in good faith say that, because it's often the case that the church you go to really does shape your faith.
Yeah.
And can shape your life. And sometimes you could be at a church that looks like a church, sounds like a church, whatever, but it's actually something different. It's a cult. It's a charismatic leader just sort of finding monthly funding for himself, sort of using people and stuff like that. So the added difficulty of this topic is sometimes it's because I could say, okay, just check what they believe. But oftentimes when you read a statement of faith of a lot of churches, it's the same. They say we believe in Jesus, we believe in God, and these sort of things. And you're like, everyone has the same statement of faith, but what they practice sometimes is miles apart.
Yeah.
So it's very, very difficult. And so the way I would sort of look at it, because there's a bunch of ways we can go, and this really could be a kind of a 6-part series looking at church history and things like that. But what I thought might be good to do is to cover something we've covered before in a different podcast episode, which is looking at, I suppose, the difference between sort of primary issues, secondary issues, tertiary issues,
right,
gospel essentials, and so on and so forth. So the church you go to matters. In order for something to be a church or somewhere, that we call it ecclesia, the body of Christ, then it has to look like one. So there's some primary things that I believe a denomination, a church has to affirm in order for me to call it a Christian denomination. Now, these are general. These are just 8 things. The truth is there could be 20, there could be 30, but these are 8 that I think most would agree on. One is that they believe that Jesus Christ is God. So they believe in the deity of Christ. I could proof text all of this, but again, for the sake of sort of being quick, I won't. The podcast, unfortunately, is about sort of being short, even though I like, Anyways, so the deity of Christ. One is that they believe in salvation by grace, right? So you're saved by grace. Grace is the process through which you're saved. Third is that they believe in salvation through Christ alone. So it's Christ alone that saves you, not sacraments, not extra this, not paying offering, not favors with the pastor, but you're saved through Christ alone. You put your faith in him by grace through faith. Fourth is that they believe in the resurrection of Jesus. They believe he actually came back from the dead, thus taking the sting out of death, taking the sting out of the grave. They hold firm that Jesus came back from the dead. Fifth is they believe in the gospel, evangelion, the good news of Jesus, that he came down to restore a relationship we have. He died the death we should have died. He lived the life we couldn't live. And by your faith in him, you get to know God. 6 is they believe there's only one God, so they're monotheists. Mono meaning one. They believe there's one God. 7 is that they believe in the Holy Trinity. Yeah. And then 8th is that they believe that faith is our principal currency. It's through faith that we get to know God, we get to believe in Jesus, and it's not all these other works that you have to do, as it were. Yeah. Now, all those, for me, are primary issues.
Yeah, those are the foundations.
They're foundations. If a church doesn't affirm those, it is not a church. Leave, run. All these things we can put in the descriptions. I can show you lots of scripture that backs up these kind of very central claims. They're not debatable. They're very clear.
Yeah.
And so for me, if you're looking for a church, you're assessing your church, first ask yourself, do they believe these things? Assuming they believe these things, there are then what I would call secondary and tertiary issues.
Okay.
Secondary issue means, for me, means worship types. So these are how churches do things, right?
Like the culture within the church.
Culture within the church, certain practices they have, these sort of things. And then tertiary are preferences, just things that churches like. They're not really biblical. These are just things the churches does. Now, on secondary and tertiary issues, there's a continuum. Because your worship type can be so off that it actually corrupts all the other things that you said you believe.
Yeah.
And it can go in both ways, and I'll talk about them very quickly so you can assess your church and think about it. So on worship types, you know, a healthy church is a balanced church. So churches that are dictatorial in one way or the other, you ought to be quite skeptical about. So for instance, charismatic churches. There are churches that are so charismatic that what they do isn't biblical. And they actually don't make any attempt to even justify it biblically. They just do it. And because there's one guy that's like sort of powerful at the front, whatever he says goes. Now, no, being charismatic in and of itself, charismatic coming from the Greek, the term charismatas, which basically means sort of gifts. There is absolutely nothing wrong with being expressive and being sort of exuberant as a believer. Nothing wrong with that. But the pendulum can swing to a place where it's not biblical because we're out here convulsing on the floor. People are randomly kind of speaking in tongues. There's no translation. There's all these weird things happening that you're like, this isn't biblical. And when you say that, it's like, shh, man. Like you're stopping the vibe. Feel the spirit. Don't be religious. That's obviously a problem. Hold on. Okay, we still got 4 minutes. Okay. That's obviously a problem. That's a worship type that's gone too far. You know, 1 Corinthians 14 makes it clear. If you're speaking tongues in a corporate setting, translate. If there's no translation, stop it. And it's not even spiritual. You know, sometimes people are like, I've seen this thing of like chanting music with tongues being spoken, like on TikTok. I've seen it.
Oh, really?
Yeah. It's like this. I don't know if it's a movement, but I see it. And sometimes I'm just confused because I'm like, when you don't know the purpose of something, abuse is always inevitable. So people just like, shande, like whatever. But like, no one's translating. And everyone's just like, oh, it's spiritual. And it's like,
just feel it.
It's not. Respectfully, it doesn't matter how you feel. It's not biblical. But the same thing's true of some churches that are they're too religious. So you might have a worship type where it's a bit more reserved, a bit more conservative. Nothing wrong with it, just like the way being charismatic isn't a problem. But sometimes the pendulum swings too much when they're so religious that they start to import stuff into the Bible that's not there. Like, for instance, I remember speaking at a church once and people clapped for me after. And someone came to me and they're like, that was brilliant. Right? They were being kind. They were like, that was really brilliant. And I was like, thank you. And they were like, and you even got a round of applause. That never happens here. And I was like, thank you. So I was speaking to the pastor after. I was like, someone told me that round of applauses. And they were like, oh, yeah, we don't really clap because it's not a performance, you know. We don't think that's something people should do. And I thought to myself, okay, I see how you can make the point that clapping is for, but also when you clap, you're training your mind about what it should appreciate. So the same way you clap for like your child's dance recital, why wouldn't you clap for something? But you see the point. That's a worship type. But if they start stopping everyone from clapping, or if you lift your hands up in worship, like put your hand down, you can see how you're like, okay, now this is
not
getting
free
to a stage
to
where
actually.
This is it. It's now dictatorial. Just like the people convulsing on the floor going shande with no translation is ridiculous. It's the same way someone not allowing people to lift their hands up in worship is also a bit ridiculous. So with tertiary issues, which we're talking about preferences now, this is where I think we have to be very careful, because I find that a lot of the oddness that happens in churches happens in the tertiary part. What do I mean by that? Most churches have that statement of faith. So if you went to see their gospel essentials, the primary issues, you'd be like, oh, it's a church. They believe all these things that Mike said. On the secondary issues, they might actually not be wild. So they're not on the floor convulsing, you know, you kind of speaking in tongues, or they're not really super religious. They're sort of in the middle, say like, this is great. The preferences is where I think the actual issue is, because it's very hard to justify biblically any of these preferences. And you have to be very discerning to see it. There are some churches where the leaders are controlling and manipulative, but you can't prove that biblically. You know, you have to watch how they behave. When you say, I'm going to this other church, are they like, why are you doing that? What are you doing? You can't go. When you say, I've got a friend that's from this church, and they're like, why are you doing that? When you say, I'm reading a book from this other pastor, and they're like, why are you doing that? That's where you have to kind of go, why is this church trying to control every part of my life? Such that if I want to travel, if I want to do something, there's a protocol where I have to speak to the pastor about it. If I want to, go on holiday, I've heard of churches where you have to go to your pastor and ask him if it's a good time to go on holiday.
As someone ministering or someone just a regular member?
A lay member of the church.
Okay.
I mean, even ministering, you'd say, obviously if you're being paid and you're working in the church, I get it.
That's why it'll be different.
But
as
just
a member,
just going on holiday, it's a bit. Why should the church control when I go on holiday with my family? You can see these things, and there's other preferences. There's some churches, for instance, who have it's very led. There's a charismatic leader at the front that often leads everything, and on posters their head is massive, and in the middle of a poster, and everyone's head is small, and all these sort of different things.
Yes,
like it may sound flippant, but these are clues that show you that this church, where's the service culture in this church? Where is the sense of it's a community? And when is it the sense that it's one man who's sort of the powerful man who everyone's sort of behind and trying to learn and borrow from? Those structures, I think, is worth being suspicious of and saying to what degree is this community a community, and to what degree is it a fan club for one person? And that's the reality, right? The same thing as, as I said before, discouraging relationships with people who go to the church, rushing people into ministry and service and saying the only way to love God is to serve in this church. Why do they do that? Oftentimes because it's harder for you to leave, because once you go, so all these things are preferences, but I think just being discerning and trying to stay away from extremes will probably be what guides you. And it's very difficult, like I said, because again, it's hard to know this. Hence why it's actually healthy to have relationships with people outside of your church. Because they can tell you that's a bit odd. Other Christians might say, I remember one experience I had, a quick story of one person who, I went to see them at the time, and they had like a set of 50 books from one pastor. And it was their pastor. And I sort of made the flippant comment. I love reading, so when I saw it, I was like, 50 books by one person. That's a bit odd. And they were like, why are you saying that? What's wrong with it? I like my pastors, and they had this kind of energy of like they're very defensive, and it was just a flippant comment I made. But that was a clue for me. I said, this is interesting. They didn't go, I just like his writing. There was a sort of defensive mode they switched onto. So I thought, now upon further kind of inspection, that's a church that I think has cultist tendencies, because when is their pastor's birthday, all their phone display pictures of the pastor, there's a confusion of sort of honor and respect, and to the level where it's basically it feels like idol worship. And people don't say that it's not spiritual, but it's like it's obvious.
Call a spade a spade.
This is what I mean. So that's the discerning factor I think a believer needs to kind of assess. So to your question, it doesn't matter what church you go to. It's hard, but guided by the Spirit, a community of believers, not just ones that go to your church, but a community of believers, and just you being discerning, you can sort of suss out where's a healthy, safe ground to be and where's a bit sort of left.
You kind of touched on like a personal story or something. But before we get to that, to end this episode, I was just thinking of what you said about tertiary like options and things that you can see in churches. I think that's tied a lot into like trauma as well, because I think depending on what background you come from, if you come from a Christian background and you grew up in your parents' churches, you're kind of shaped in like your experience there as to what you do after. Sure. Either it was a bad experience and you go to a church that's nothing like them, or it was a good experience, so every church has to kind of like mirror what they did. Or you're not Christian at all, you don't understand this Christian thing, and just come into churches where you see people convulsing on the floor, it's like, what is going on? What have I entered into? Is this what church is about? Or for example, you come from a very energetic background and you go into a church where they're just like Catholic style, not doing much, not moving much, no one's kind of talking, no one's kind of interacting with each other. So I guess basically just telling people to recognize and understand that sometimes some of your tertiary options and preferences may be dictated by past traumas, especially when it comes to like religion, and trauma that is involved there. So dealing with that is definitely an important thing to start with.
I agree. And it's funny you should mention that, because I do think part of my journey was being raised in a very Pentecostal setting. I overcorrected. And I went left into like everything must be absolutely not Pentecostal. Then you realize actually the Bible says don't despise prophecy. The Bible speaks about earnestly desiring gifts. So you start to learn. Okay, how do I stay in the happy medium where I avoid sort of charismania, we call it, where it's ridiculous stuff that we're like, oh yeah, it's spiritual because it feels weird, and it's like, well, it's odd. It's not biblical. So how do I avoid that? But how do I also avoid just religiosity, where I'm elevating how worship is done rather than what's actually been said to God, and I can't express myself. I want to cry, but I'm like, no crying allowed. And it's like, that's obviously also a problem. So avoiding extremes, I think, is always the way to go. And we have to call spade a spade. Like I call out charismania now, but I also call out religiosity when I go, they're both a problem. They're both ends of a spectrum we ought not to be on. Instead, we want to be in a happy medium, in a place where there's an attempt at biblical fidelity. They try to keep close to the Bible. They're honest about what they get wrong. There's no cult worship. The leader's happy to remove himself from the picture. He's not constantly... The giveaway, this is a slight joke, but like when you see a poster, if your pastor's head is 10 times everyone else's head in the middle,
I knew it.
That's often the clip.
Yeah, it is. and like he's not capping. Like it's so true, because it's like you see that. Just go to one or two church services, it will start to reveal itself what's kind of like going on in that church. Now, this is a wonderful conversation, right? So I'm going to end it off with two things, right? Just something fun, right?
Okay.
What's one red flag or one thing you've seen in a church, you're like, yep, no, I'm out of here? You've been to a church, you're like,
I think the minute I see that the ministers have different chairs, I'm like, I'm good.
Because like
why is their back?
Style.
Why is their back? Come on, there's elders in the church with bad backs, and they have like terrible chairs. But some young 30-year-old minister has like extra cushions.
I know that one was like the young child would run after service and like go on the chair and start playing. Slap that child.
Get your head self.
That's pastor's chair.
That's it, pastor's chair.
Yeah. I think a red flag for me, I think for people who are kind of like in a life situation that I'm in, it's like, oh, I've just come out of being at uni. Don't go to student-led churches. There can be fellowships, but they're not churches. And I think it's odd to say, but it's very common. And that's a trap that I fell in for many years, and there's a trap that I know many people fall into. So that's a red flag. If you see that this is being called a church, go to it on a Wednesday, but go to a proper community church on a Sunday, right? That's not a church. And be very, very aware of that.
Should we do green flags as well, like good ones?
Yeah, I think we should.
Just negative.
Balance it out. Yeah, I think we should.
My green flag, I love churches where I actually can speak to the pastor. As I don't have to book an appointment and that's 6 weeks away or anything. Like I can speak to him after church. So that means there's a restriction on the size of the church. You can't have that if your church is 2,000 people strong. So churches where you can speak to the pastor and you sense a humility in the pastor. He's just a guy that's given himself to be served by God. And he doesn't come across as a sort of like, I'm at this heightened spiritual place, but he attempts to show you that, I'm just one beggar telling you another beggar where the bread is. And I think I'm really interested in that. When I see leaders that show humility, genuine humility, it's the most attractive thing in a pastor or a leader.
That's so good. For me, I would say I love churches who know how to display good community. It's not forced where it's like, it's very good to interact with people when they come to your church for the first time. Extremely important. But it's not like, hey, so I've seen you for the first time. We're best friends now. No, but it's like it's authentic community. Like they see you,
getting to know you.
I talk about my current church now, how that journey has been from someone who's quite awkward and quite introverted.
You are awkward.
Just cut.
I'm joking. Sorry. It was right there. Sorry.
No. So it's like I think just the journey of just continuing going, and now it's like I've built a church that I know it's like. They really care about me. Like they won't just see me fall on the wayside. Like it's not like they'll just turn up in my house, but it's like if they need to, they'll be there for me. So just that authentic community that you see in churches. That's and beautiful. It's like even if you just go to a church for the first time, you can feel it when you walk in when they have authentic community.
Even when you watch them online with each other, you're like, oh wow, like there's something warm here, something real here, something authentic here.
Yeah. Man, that was in depth. I really love this conversation. This was a very good podcast episode. So if you're, looking for a church, or you're someone who's just gone to uni, or you know someone who has, share it with someone. I'm sure even if it's not something you're currently dealing with, it's something you've probably dealt with or someone else will. Share it with your family, share it with your friends, and just let people know basically what we have to say about churches and finding, a good church for yourself where you can grow in. But with that being said, please leave a like, leave a comment, and we will see you in the next episode. See you later.